On the morning of January 5th, 1943, a Japanese dive bomber pulled off its attack run off Guadalcanal, and the pilot did what every pilot did in those seconds. He read the anti-aircraft fire. The black bursts came up behind him, scattered and late, the way they almost always came. By every rule the war had taught him, he was clear of it. Then his plane came apart in the air, and no American shell had touched it. He had read the fire correctly. He had judged it by the same standard every airman on every side had trusted since the war began. And that standard had stopped being true somewhere in the previous few seconds. What had changed was a single device, and the problem it solved was much older than the war. Hitting a moving plane with a shell is a question of probability, and the probability is dismal. The shell is small, the sky is vast, the target is turning. Before 1943, a gunner had only two ways to bring a plane down. He could land a direct hit, which almost never happened, or he could burst a shell near it with a timed fuse. The timed fuse was the hard part. Even with analog gun directors doing the aiming, machines that fed range and speed into the guns, the gunner still had to predict where the plane would sit several seconds into the future, throw the shell at that empty patch of sky, and set the fuse to detonate at the precise instant the round and the target met there. Two separate predictions, and both had to be right. At the start of the London Blitz, the British estimated that bringing down one aircraft cost something on the order of 20,000 rounds. So pilots learned the lesson the arithmetic taught them. Flak was loud and frightening. It filled the sky with black smoke, and most of the time it killed no one. An airman who flew through it and came out the far side drew the obvious conclusion, and the conclusion was correct. The fire he had just survived could be survived again. The pilot off Guadalcanal had spent 2 years of war learning exactly that. His confidence was not arrogance. It was data. What this pilot could not know was that one cruiser in the task force beneath him had loaded its guns with a shell that had been a secret for 3 years. The USS Helena's 5-inch guns were firing a projectile that carried a working radio in its nose, a miniature transmitter and receiver sealed into the fuse. As the round flew, it sent out a steady signal and listened for the echo coming back. When it passed close to something solid, that echo shifted, and at a set threshold, a small circuit closed and triggered the charge. The round no longer had to strike the plane. It no longer had to be timed to a guessed point in open air. It only had to come near. Anything that crossed within about 70 feet of the target had, in practical terms, been hit. That morning, 4 HE dive bombers, the type the Allies called the Val, had come down on the task force, and one of them had already put a bomb into the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. As the Vals turned for home, Helena's aft 5-inch battery opened up on them, almost as an afterthought. 2 salvos went out. One of the Vals fell. The gunners who fired those rounds had just shot down an aircraft with the first proximity-fused shells ever used in combat, and most of them did not yet know it. The shell's fuse had been given a name built to describe nothing. They called it the variable time fuse, the VT fuse, a phrase that hinted at an adjustable timer and not one thing more. It read as an ordinary upgrade to an ordinary part. That impression was the whole purpose of the name, because the men who built it had understood that a weapon the enemy cannot name is a weapon he cannot prepare for. The sailors who used it skipped the official term and called it the funny fuse. The reason the shell had taken 3 years to build sat inside it: a radio. The idea had crossed the Atlantic from Britain in 1940, handed to American scientists with a trunk of other secrets. And the obstacle never changed. A radio small enough to ride in an artillery shell still had to survive being fired out of an artillery gun. A 5-inch gun throws its shell to nearly half a mile a second in an instant, and everything packed inside endures a shock near 20,000 times the force of gravity. Glass vacuum tubes, the fragile heart of 1940s electronics, do not live through that kind of jolt. They had to be rebuilt until they did. One of the men who solved the tube problem was a young physicist named James Van Allen, who years later found the rings of trapped radiation around the Earth that still carry his name. A single finished fuse held close to 130 separate parts. The program built more than 22 million of these fuses. It ran across more than 100 factories and cost over $1 billion in the money of the time. Merle Tuve, the physicist who ran the laboratory at the center of it, gave his staff a standard no peacetime engineer would recognize. Don't try for an A. In a war, D is necessary and enough, but an F is fatal. The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late. Most people won't look this up on their own. That's what this channel is for. Subscribe if you want to keep going. Building the fuse was only half of the program. The other half's keeping the enemy from ever learning it existed, and that second task decided how the weapon could be used. The logic was blunt. A fuse fired over water and missed, dropped into the sea, gone for good, beyond anyone's reach. A fuse fired over land and missed fell onto solid ground where an enemy could collect the pieces, take them apart, and grasp the principle. So the first rule wrote itself. The fuse went to sea. The Navy in the Pacific received it ahead of every other force, used it against Japanese planes over deep ocean. Firing it above enemy-held land was forbidden outright, and that ban held for more than a year and a half, past the first kill off Guadalcanal. The reasoning was cold, and it was also right. The caution ran further than rules about geography. While Tuve's laboratory built the fuse, a separate effort took on the opposite job, defeating it. The work went to a radar specialist named Winfield Salisbury, who set out to build a jammer that would trip the fuse before it reached its target, on the theory that the Allies had better find the weak point before an enemy blundered into it. Salisbury needed about 2 weeks. His jammer made the fuses fire 4,000 feet from their targets instead of 40. The Allies then took that result, the proof that their war-winning shell could be switched off by anyone who understood it, and classified it more closely than the fuse itself. They had built a secret weapon, then built the machine that could defeat it and hidden that machine deeper than the weapon itself. From inside a Japanese cockpit, none of this was on display. There was no warning, no fresh sound, no visible shift in the guns far below. There was only the fire, and the fire behaved like a different thing now. The bursts that once trailed behind and below seemed to lean over and find the plane. A near miss, the event every airman had been trained to walk away from, was now often the end of the flight. By 1943, though only about a quarter of the American anti-aircraft ammunition in the Pacific carried the new fuse, that single quarter accounted for close to half of every enemy plane brought down by naval gunfire. The fuse made a gun about 3 times as lethal. By 1945, the figure was nearer 6 times, and that stayed true even though as many as a third of the fuses were duds that did nothing at all. The fuse never worked on its own. By 1944, an enemy plane closing on an American task force was flying into a system. Radar found it far out while it was still a smudge on a screen. A combat information center tracked it and fed the firing solution to the guns, and radar-driven directors swung the 5-inch mounts onto it. The shells those mounts threw carried the fuse. The pilot was no longer dueling a gun crew. He was flying into a machine that had been tracking him since before he could see the ships. What those air crews made of all this is hard to recover today, and the reason it is hard to recover is the heart of the story. An airman can describe a weapon he knows about. He can name the fighter that bounced him, the flak he climbed through, the gun emplacement on the ridge. He cannot describe a fuse whose very existence is a guarded secret an ocean away. The surviving Japanese accounts of these engagements report that American anti-aircraft fire had grown heavier and that it had grown far harder to live through. They do not say why. The men who wrote them had been handed nothing that would explain it. In June 1944, over the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan's naval aviation hurled mass attacks at the American carrier fleet and was all but destroyed inside 2 days. The crews who fired the guns called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The fuse did not stay at sea. When German V-1 flying bombs began falling on London in the summer of 1944, the ban on firing over land came off so the guns could defend the city. And inside a few weeks, proximity-fused batteries were knocking down close to 79% of the V-1s that crossed into their range. That winter, in the Battle of the Bulge, the rounds went to work over land in a second way, against troops in the open. Patton's Third Army fired them, and in a letter to Washington, he described catching an enemy unit trying to cross a river and counting 702 dead afterward. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating, he wrote. Once every army had it, he added, they would have to devise some new method of warfare. The fuse stayed secret long after the guns went quiet. It sat among the most closely held programs of the entire war, spoken of in the same breath as radar and the atomic bomb staying, and years passed before the full account of it reached the public. So for the Japanese pilots who had flown through that fire and lived, and for the families of the ones who had not, There was a long stretch of time with a hole punched in the middle of the story. They knew the American fire had changed somewhere out over the Pacific. They knew it had begun reaching them in a way it never had before. They never learned what it was called. One side had built the thing in 100 factories and handed it a name chosen to reveal nothing. The other side only ever saw the result, a shell that killed without touching, and was left to wonder about it.